What a time to be alive. We can learn from top-level instructors at the click of a button. But with so much content out there, how do we determine which instructionals to watch? And after we decide which one we're going to watch, how do we watch it in a way that allows us to retain the information? These are the questions that I'm hoping to address in this video. Instructionals have been massively beneficial to the jiu-jitsu community. Whether you decide to purchase instructionals or do most of your learning through free content on platforms like YouTube, you can now take learning into your own hands. As someone who has been around jiu-jitsu a few years before being introduced to instructional content, I personally find instructionals, especially Danaher's instructionals, very valuable in validating which techniques work and which don't at the highest levels. I also think instructionals do a great job of relaying concepts and fine-tuning minor details to make techniques work. So say for example, I'm watching Danaher's guard passing instructional, and over my 4 years of training jiu-jitsu before watching instructional videos, I learned like 15 different ways to open up a closed guard. And then Danaher comes along and gives a great outline of just different concepts and principles to keep in mind when passing the guard. And then goes on to say that there's really only a couple ways to effectively open up a closed guard and teaches those techniques in very fine detail. So now, as someone who is relatively familiar with the position already, the value that I get out of this instructional is that now I have a nice clear roadmap as to what I'm generally trying to accomplish when passing the guard. And because I have a lot of trust in Danaher's experience, I focus on the techniques that he validated. Now that we understand how valuable instructionals are, how do we determine which instructionals to watch? And to me, this is kind of a two-phase question, right? The first one being which instructor do we choose? And the second being which instructional do we choose from that instructor? So when deciding which instructor to pick, I think it's important to pick one instructor to be the primary source of instructional information you consume. That way you develop a relationship with that instructor and understand the language they speak. So whether that's Lachlan Giles or Andrew Wiltsey or Danaher, which a lot of you can probably tell I am biased towards, but it's going to be different for everyone. And luckily for us, they all have a lot of free content out there online. So before making this decision, I recommend checking out the free content and making sure that you subscribe or even support them through Patreon, because making free content like this is reliant on people like you to keep the lights on. So if you really enjoy Lachlan Giles' content, then great, roll with him as your primary instructor. But the downside to just having one instructor is that you don't get to see different perspectives. So while I do recommend having one primary instructor that you go to for instructional content, I do think if you really enjoy Lachlan Giles and his half guard instructional and you're planning on making that a big part of your game, it might be a good idea to watch Danaher's half guard instructional as well, so you get a different perspective and can use details from each to help create the best game for you. So now for me, I primarily watch Danaher's instructionals, but he has so many of them, it can be very overwhelming where to start. And I imagine there is a best way to go about this, but honestly, I just think whatever gets you excited to go train, that is what you should study. Because at the end of the day, if you're stoked on the journey of jiu-jitsu, you're going to be much better off in the long run as to someone who's just trying to grind through it. However, one thing to consider that's really helped me a lot is that I really enjoy watching instructional content on the flip side of the coin as to whatever we're working on in class. So say for this example, during the next few weeks of class, we're going to be working on side control escapes. And during class, we spend about 20 minutes a day doing situationals from side control. Now, the idea behind situationals is that it gives you more reps in a given situation. And in the book, The Talent Code, they talk about how futsal is used in Brazil as a means of enhancing ball control in soccer. Because someone who grows up playing futsal has probably touched the ball about 6 times as much as someone who grew up playing soccer. So their ability to control the ball and handle the ball in intense scenarios is going to be much higher just because they've done it much more. And in jiu-jitsu, we try to apply this same idea through situationals. But if you spend 20 minutes a day in side control situationals, that means probably 10 minutes are on top and 10 minutes are on bottom. So for me, it makes sense to have something that I'm working on from both top and bottom of side control. So during these 2 weeks, my primary focus would be watching Gordon Ryan's side pin instructional. That way, when I'm on top, I'm practicing the techniques from Gordon Ryan's instructional. And when I'm on bottom, I'm practicing the techniques we learned in class. Especially if those techniques we're learning in class are validated through a Danaher instructional. And this is one of the reasons I love the school that I'm associated with now, because I 100% trust the techniques that we're learning in class are not just what my instructor was taught in 1998 and now he's passing that knowledge along to us. The side control escapes being taught now in class are a result of years and years of studying the latest content. So for me, I can honestly say I've used the instructional content to make sure that the school I'm training at is where I want to be. If you're working on a sequence from half guard that you learned from Danaher's half guard instructional, and part of the sequence involves entering into the legs, and your instructor tells you that we don't do that here, it could be a sign that you're in the wrong school. And then you walk into a different school and you see the instructor teaching the same side control escape you've seen in Danaher's instructional. And then off that escape, the instructor shows the exact same half guard sequence you're working on. You may have just found your new home. So that was a bit of a tangent, but bottom line, when you're choosing an instructional, I recommend to pick one instructor as your primary instructor. And then when you find a position that you really enjoy, I recommend you get a different perspective on that position through a different instructional. And when you're choosing which instructional to get from that specific instructor, one thing that has really helped me is studying the exact opposite of what we're doing in class. Because to me, that makes the most sense when trying to maximize the time being spent in situational sparring. So now that we've picked our instructional, we need to watch it in a way that helps us retain the information. And for me, it's always been the sandwich idea, right? Where you start general, then you get specific, then you go back to general. And I honestly think Danaher is great at starting out with a very general intro. And then he also does an amazing job at getting into the nuts and bolts and how to make techniques work against high level resistance. But I do think his instructionals lack that second piece of bread at the end that bring us back to the big picture idea behind the instructional. And that's one thing I appreciate about Gordon's instructionals, because he does a great job at tying everything together in the end through his rolling commentary. Now, the way I go about watching a Danaher instructional is I'll watch the whole thing through at 2x speed to give myself a very broad framework as to the outline of the video. Then I'll go through and I'll watch it much slower. And if you've ever seen a Danaher instructional, there are many takes, especially during the first couple modules of his instructional, where it's just him talking. And when he's relaying these concepts, I've found that these are things that I can implement into my game right away, even that night in training, that will drastically improve my performance. Now, when dealing with more nuts and bolts technique-wise, a tip that was shared with me through the Discord, and I'll leave the link to the podcast in the description below, is that you record the technique on your phone, and even better than the technique, record the whole sequence. So that while you're working on that specific technique that may take weeks, if not months, to get down, you're able to have a very quick visual reference instead of written notes. And for me, I find the visual reference to be very helpful. So then throughout the couple weeks or month, whatever I'm doing, focusing on these specific techniques I'm trying to implement into my game, I'll go back and I'll watch the intro to the Danaher video, because this constantly brings you back to the big picture behind the techniques that you're trying to implement. And I think it will honestly surprise you how much this will help not only improve the techniques you're working on, but all other aspects of your jiu-jitsu. Because when you understand things on a general level, it's much easier to apply them in different scenarios. So I hope this video helped, because it is such an exciting time to be a student of jiu-jitsu. And one of the more difficult things is to navigate through all of the information that we have access to. If you've made it this far in the video, I appreciate the support, and we'll see you in the next one.